Section 5. For God has not only created us from nothing, but also granted us by the grace of the Word to live a life according to God. So as he begins section 5, he's continuing the notion from the previous section and drawing our attention to how God created us from nothing. That's the manner of creation, from nothing. But then also that he granted us by the grace of the Word to live a life according to God. So in some ways, this is the blessing of creation and the means of life after creation, is that we might live a life according to God. Right? This is our purpose. But human beings, turning away from things eternal and by the counsel of the devil, turning us towards things of corruption, were themselves the cause of corruption and death, being, as we already said, corruptible by nature, but escaping their natural state by the grace of participation in the Word, had they remained good. And so this section here is an important part of Athanasius' argument, because what he's telling us here is that we were corruptible by nature because God alone is incorruptible, because he alone is one, God, and two, eternal, and in that same sense, I guess we could say uncreated. All right, so we are corruptible by nature, but it's important to point out what he says. We could escape that corruption of our natural state if, importantly, if we lived in the grace of God by means of participation in the Word. What does that mean? Well, he's told us a little bit already, if you remember, that we were created in the image of God, and he gave us a share of the power of his own Word. And so I think this kind of link back to what he's already told us. Being created in the image of God, we've been given a share of the power of his own Word. And so this was the grace of God, that we would participate in the Word, that in right relationship with the Word, though we are by nature possibly corrupted, we could have remained good. However, as we've already seen, right, as he has already said, by our choice came corruption and death. Because of the Word present in them, even natural corruption did not come near them, just as wisdom says. God created the human being for incorruptibility and an image of his own eternity. But by the envy of the devil, death entered into the world. When this happened, human beings died, and corruption thenceforth prevailed against them, becoming even stronger than its natural power over the whole race, the more so as it had assumed the threat of the deity against them through the transgression of the commandment. So it's through the transgression of the commandment that this all comes to pass. And what happens is human beings died, and corruption therefore prevailed against them. And so, in one sense, we see kind of this corruption and death as the constant enemy of all subsequent humanity. That Adam and Eve's sin brought corruption and death, and we all likewise live in that corruption and death, both that they committed and kind of brought upon creation, and also that which we, of course, bring in of our own sin. He even says that it became even stronger over time. And so we'll see this a little bit later on in his argument about the idea of it becoming even stronger. For even in their transgressions, human beings had not stopped short of any defined limits, but gradually pressing forward, they had passed beyond all measure. From the beginning, they were inventors of evil and called death and corruption down upon themselves, while later, turning to vice and exceeding all lawlessness, not stopping at one evil, but contriving in time every new evil, they became insatiable in sinning. And so this entire section here is a little bit disturbing. But what we find is not stopped short of any defined limits, gradually pressing forward in our sin. We, in fact, had passed beyond all measure. From the beginning, they were inventors of evil. Of course, calling death and corruption upon ourselves. This is not something that God sent upon us. It's not something that God created in the world itself. It's that we called it upon ourselves by being inventors of evil, passing beyond all measure as we gradually pressed forward and didn't stop short of any limits in our sin. But then he goes on, he says, while later turning to vice, so this is again something we've done, and exceeding all lawlessness. Right, this has got to a pretty bad point. Not stopping at one evil, but in fact contriving in time every new evil. And then they became insatiable in sinning. And I think this phrase right here really gets at the heart of what Athanasius is saying. It's not one petty sin that God has therefore punished with this massive punishment. He's saying that we have become insatiable in sinning. He goes on to explain that. For there were adulteries and thefts everywhere. The whole earth was full of murders and plundering. There was no concern for law regarding corruption and vice. Every wickedness, individually and jointly, was being carried out by all. Cities warred against cities, and nations rose up against nations. The whole world was torn apart by factions and battles, everyone competing in lawlessness. Even acts against nature were not far from them. But as the witness of Christ, the apostle said, their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural, and in the same way also the men, leaving aside natural relations with women, were consumed with their desire for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due reward for their error. So his point here is that human beings have fallen into just incredible sinfulness. And so we can just kind of put the mark here anywhere, but somewhere in the notes. The idea that human sinfulness knows no boundaries. It is insatiable. We continue to pursue it and invent new ways to participate in it. This is the nature of humanity. Having fallen, continuing in corruption, and becoming insatiable in sinning. We see it in adultery, theft, murder, plundering, war, homosexuality, all nature of things. In fact, everyone competing in lawlessness. Who can be worse? And this is almost, again, a reminder for me of Augustine when he talks about the pear tree incident and some of the things he says. I wouldn't have done it if I were alone, but in the company of others, he wanted to be seen as worse in the eyes of others. He would participate in things, and in a sense, competing in lawlessness. And so Athanasius, I think, has a good insight into the human condition. He says the scriptures are clear about this. Our experience of life is likewise clear. That once again, going all the way back, that God who created us from nothing and granted us the grace to live a life according to God have now become insatiable in sinning and compete in lawlessness. So that's where we find ourselves at the end of section 5.